everyone. Welcome to PSEG True Diversity Film Series. My name is Donna Walker-Kuhn. I am Senior Advisor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at NJPAC. Happy Juneteenth, everyone. Today's panel is in celebration of this auspicious date, as well as discussing the topic of reparations. We have an esteemed panel who are going to discuss reparations from many different facets, what it means, its application, and what each of us can do. In celebration of Juneteenth, we have a video that we would like to share with you that just kind of gives you the highlights of what Juneteenth is about and its significance. So let's take a look. Thanks.
What is Juneteenth? Juneteenth is the oldest known celebration commemorating the ending of slavery in the United States. President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing enslaved Africans in the United States in 1862, and the 13th Amendment passed Congress, officially abolishing the institution of slavery in 1863. But it would take years for word to spread. On June 19, 1865, Union soldiers led by Major General Gordon Granger landed at Galveston, Texas, with the news that the Civil War was over and the roughly 250,000 enslaved people there were now free. The orders read, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness either there or elsewhere." You might be wondering why it took so long to spread the word. General Robert E. Lee surrendered in April 1865, but Union troops didn't arrive until June. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed enslaved Africans in the Confederate States liberated by Union troops, and that didn't include Texas. Though slaves were lawfully freed, they were far from free. Many were even punished for trying to take advantage of their new rights. One former slave recalled seeing people shot and hanged after trying to escape to freedom, and another shared an account of being asked to work another 6 years and being whipped just like she was before. Even though the newly freed in Texas didn't receive the full benefits of freedom, they turned the day into a celebration. June 19th was coined Juneteenth, a blending of the words June and 19th. Every year, Juneteenth became a chance for people to get together with family members, measure progress against freedom, and teach rising generations the importance of self-improvement. They would read the Emancipation Proclamation, hear sermons, share meals, and play games. And many of those same traditions carry on today in Juneteenth celebrations across the country. Texas became the first state to make Juneteenth an official holiday in 1980. Since then, 46 other states and the District of Columbia have recognized Juneteenth as a state holiday or holiday observance. Although not a federal holiday, many global companies like Twitter, Square, Nike, and Lyft have made the day a company holiday in the wake of protests to end systemic racism sparked by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Today, more than 150 years after celebrations began, June 19th is about remembering the past and moving toward a future that involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves. Juneteenth, a celebration of freedom and the fight for its fulfillment.
In addition to today's panel acknowledging Juneteenth, NJPAC has shared our perspective on social media and internally at our all-staff meetings. Our African American Employee Resource Group prepared a very informative video providing the history and meaning of Juneteenth that was shared with all of our staff. So our social justice efforts are both internal and external. So as I said, the theme for our panel tonight is reparations, continuing the fight for economic justice. And we're referencing the film Banished, The Ethnic Cleansing of Blacks in America, which explores this point. And I hope you were able to see it from the link that we shared with your registration. Social Justice Series is part of our Standing in Solidarity initiative. And the purpose of this series is to bring our community together and encourage everyone to take part in the movement to ensure civil rights for all. On our website, you can find archived prior social justice panel discussions, as well as resources that will help you take action. We're also very happy to have as our advisors the Newark NAACP, New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, Newark Arts, and Truth Racial Healing Transformation Center at Rutgers University, Newark. This time, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. The language we're using was created with consultation and guidance from Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapo Lenape Munsee tribe and Oleana Whispering Dove of the Eastern Salagi Algonquian descendant. We're grateful to both of them for the generosity, wisdom, and labor to craft these words. NJPAC is situated on unceded traditional lands of the Munsee Lenape, the Canarsie, the Weekasqueak, and the Siwanoy. Our territory, currently known as New York City, originates from the indigenous population that once inhabited the island of Manhattan and its collective 5 boroughs within Turtle Island, in addition to the land of where New Jersey sits. To the region of Lower Manhattan, we're indebted to the Canarsie, whose chief Sezes met with the Dutch. And to the region of Upper Manhattan, we give reverence to the Weekasqueak. Let us now walk with the knowledge that each and every one of us is a guardian of most importance as we put upon this Turtle Island, not to seek dominion, but as caretakers, as two-leggeds, to protect and grow each other, to love and offer kindness. We are here to ensure that the gifts of earth, water, and air remain pure and whole. And so let us be guardians of the earth, the water, and the air, the crawlers, the swimmers, the mammal people, and the green. In this way, we honor the land which gives us life. We honor the lives of culture forsaken, and we honor the prospect of renewed alliances. Moreover, let this moment of recognition be a monument of action, action that is fortified with the cooperative spirit and reverence for our traditional ways. Please help me welcome PSEG Representative Calvin Ledford, who is president of the PSEG Foundation and Director of Corporate Social Responsibility. We are so delighted that PSEG is our corporate sponsor for Standing in Solidarity. Mr. Ledford, in his role as president of the foundation, has oversight of the philanthropic areas of corporate citizenship, volunteerism, foundation and corporate giving, and the foundation's programs and operations. Prior to this role, Mr. Ledford, over a 30-year career at PSEG allowed him to work extensively with communities and stakeholders all across our service and territory. Mr. Ledford also serves as the chairman of the Newark Regional Business Partnership and is the board member of the Foundation of University Hospital, Education Foundation of the League of Municipalities, and Leadership Newark. The PSEG Foundation, philanthropic arm of Public Service Enterprise Group, prioritizes investments in equity and economic empowerment, environmental sustainability, and social justice in the communities served by PSEG. Welcome, Mr. Ledford.
And happy Juneteenth to you and everyone viewing this program. Thank you for that introduction, Donna. Welcome everyone again to tonight's event. I'm Calvin Ledford, president of the PSEG Foundation and director of corporate social responsibility for PSEG. Very proud sponsors of the PSEG True Diversity film series. Our company, Public Service, and the PSEG Foundation are pleased to be longtime partners with the New Jersey Performing Arts Center. PSEG was amongst the early supporters of NJPAC and the True Diversity film series, which represents the best of that relationship. In fact, we've continued our support and recently announced a 2-year pledge to NJPAC for the Standing in Solidarity program, which includes the True Diversity film series. It's personally gratifying to be addressing you all so close to the observance of Juneteenth, commemorating the emancipation of enslaved people. Now more than ever, as President Biden has signed the Juneteenth bill, which designates it as a national holiday, and the first new national holiday since Martin Luther King Jr. Day, signed in 1983. This is a new beginning of hope, equity, inclusion, equality, and social justice for Black and Brown people, uniting in a time for change across the country. Furthermore, this film series is a reflection of PSEG's commitment to this change, especially here in Newark, where we're more than just another utility company, as you know, and more than just another company. Public service has made its headquarters and its home in this community for well over a century. We are in our company's 118th anniversary year. We're proud of our commitment as citizens of Newark and as citizens of New Jersey. A tremendous part of that commitment is our support for organizations such as NJPAC, and what that support means for diversity, inclusion, for education, and especially the arts. 1 year ago, in the wake of the tragic murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis and the demonstrations that followed in cities and communities around the country and the globe, PSEG and the PSEG Foundation announced another commitment, the Powering Equity and Social Justice Initiative. The initiative is the PSEG Foundation's $1 million commitment to support organizations that address racial, social injustice, inequality, and human rights in communities of color in New Jersey, New York, and anywhere PSEG operates. Under our very first act under the Powering Equity and Social Justice Initiative was providing Rutgers University and the Rutgers Center on Policing to assist police departments to become better equipped to engage with people in communities of color. And in order to emphasize the importance of providing support in such areas of critical community need, the PSEG Foundation has realigned its giving strategy under 3 new pillars: environmental sustainability, social justice, equity, and economic empowerment. When one of us is impacted in the community, we all feel the impact. That is why it is essential that we all join together and act and build upon a framework of equity, compassion, and respect throughout the many diverse communities we represent, and that will truly, truly benefit us all. On behalf of PSEG, we believe that our long-standing support for diversity, inclusion, education, and the arts help us contribute to that idea. The American dream of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness can be achieved and should be achieved by us all. Now, it is my honor to welcome all of you to this important and timely event/discussion. Thank you for being here this evening. Please enjoy the discussion. Back to you, Donna, and thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm now delighted to introduce our moderator for this evening, Liz Shevchenko. Liz has spent over 25 years coordinating initiatives to collectively reckon with historical harms, including to imagine diverse ideas for reparations. She was founding director of the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience, a network of places of memory that invite their societies to confront contested histories and their contemporary legacies. She founded the Humanities Action Lab, a growing consortium of over 30 universities led from Rutgers University Newark that collaborate with issue organizations and public spaces to develop student and community curated public memory projects around contested social issues. HAL's latest project is Climates of Inequality, Stories of Environmental Justice, a traveling exhibit, web platform, and other actions confronting histories of environmental racism and their legacies for the climate crisis created by over 500 students and frontline community leaders across the hemisphere. Welcome, Liz, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna, and to everybody at NJPAC for organizing this. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to participate in this conversation and facilitate it. I wanted to add a personal note about my strong feelings about this topic. My father came to this country from Warsaw, Poland in 1947. And although there in Poland, he had been labeled as racially impure, the moment he came into Ellis Island, he was welcomed as white. So although he arrived here stateless, penniless, and with no family ties whatsoever, he instantly inherited access to generations of wealth and privilege that this country sort of automatically afforded to people that it considered white. And I inherited all of what he had with interest. So exploring my own family history has made me a dedicated student of reparations in America and a committed ally to the struggle to achieve it. So tonight, I'm so honored to have the chance to learn from this extraordinary group of visionaries and organizers, and also from all of you who are participating in the question and answer session. So I'll start by asking each of them to take about a minute to introduce themselves. I hate to miss all of the ways that I would want to brag about all of their achievements, so I think they'll be too modest, but I'll start with Mr. Ryan Haygood, Esquire.
Awesome. Thank you, Liz and Donna and Calvin for hosting tonight's conversation. So excited to join you all following a weekend of real powerful activity and commemoration around the Juneteenth event for the first time in New Jersey as a state holiday and for the first time as a country as a state holiday. My name is, as a country is a holiday. My name is Ryan Haygood. As Liz mentioned, I lead the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. We are a team of really fierce advocates whose mission is to identify what we think of as sort of structural load-bearing walls of racial inequality, and when toppled, open up opportunities for people of color in this state. We focus our advocacy in three interrelated ways. One is around economic justice, the second is around criminal justice reform, and the third is around democracy and justice. I'm really excited to be here to have this conversation at such a critical moment in time.
Thank you. Next, I'll invite Reverend Charles Boyer.
Thank you so much. Definitely blessed to be here. Thank you for NJPAC and PSEG for putting this on. My name is Charles Boyer. I am the Director of Salvation and Social Justice and the pastor of Greater Mount Zion African Methodist Episcopal Church in Trenton. Salvation and Social Justice is a Black faith-rooted public policy organization. We come to this work believing that liberation should precede legislation. We recognize the historical context of the Black church and Black faith being the catalyst towards Black freedom and Black liberation all throughout this country, starting from slavery to the modern day. The Black church has always been involved, and Black people have been thrust forward and kept by hope and by reinterpreting and reimagining their reality, even their religion and their theology as thrust upon them in such a way to actually liberate them. And so we do this through a theory of change that is looks at sacred place, sacred space, and sacred history of Black folks. And we engage folks most impacted by structural racism. And we go through a process with them, which we see as from lament to liberation, and where folks who are actually experiencing the trauma of structural racism begin to reimagine and advocate for themselves a new reality. And so that's our work, and particularly here in the space of reparations, this is particularly important because we bring this conversation from slavery all the way to the modern day to even things like the drug war.
Thank you so much. And finally, Professor Enjo Mechu.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thanks everyone. I'd like to say a word of appreciation to the NJPAC leadership and everyone who had a hand in putting this program together. And for those of you who are joining us for this discussion, it's truly a delight to be part of this very rich conversation, a very timely conversation, I should add as well. My name is Enjo Mechu, and I am a law professor at Seton Hall University, where I teach classes on civil rights law, remedies, and torts, courses that are tightly hitched to the history of racial oppression in this country. And so reparations features prominently in my teaching. And what I teach in classes in conversation with my scholarship, looking at ways that the law can serve as a tool for social engineering those who have been marginalized across various axes of identity. And so I really look forward to participating in this dialogue, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you. So we wanted to start by defining what we're talking about and exploring a little bit why it has been so hard to talk about it. The conversation and the struggle is not new. So in some ways it would seem that we would be able to talk about it better by now. Black Americans have been calling for reparations for centuries, through every era of racial struggle in this country, starting with formerly enslaved Belinda Royal's successful petition to Massachusetts legislature for a pension in 1783, and continually through every era through John Conyers' introduction of a federal bill to establish a commission to study reparations in 1989. Also, the United States is unique in its sort of refusal to confront its own past. In other countries, a conversation about reckoning and reparations is not radical. Over 40 nations have made officially confronting racist histories, including reparations for historical harm, a standard requirement and a standard practice for building a stable democracy, not just even when, but especially when their society is deeply divided on the issue and there are many people opposed. And so this includes our neighbor to the north, Canada, that has made official apologies and reparations for its use of Indian residential schools and its kidnapping of First Nations children. Germany for its role in the Holocaust and also its colonization in Namibia. And Australia for economic, cultural, and spiritual losses from settler colonialism to Aboriginal peoples. So I wanted to start by asking each of you, how are each of you defining reparations, and why do you think it's been so hard to achieve here, been stalled for so long? So we'll start, if we can, with Professor Mechu. I know you come from a legal perspective, but you're an interdisciplinary scholar who approaches this much more holistically.
Thank you for those questions, Liz. And I'll start by addressing the first one initially, which I think it's really the foundation to bringing forward any meaningful action to reparations. What exactly are reparations? And so it seems to me that reparations are largely efforts to recognize and address the injustices Black people and our forebears have suffered in this country on account of race and color. And part of that recognition is an acknowledgement that we live in a society that bears the scars of the past, that we live in a society that has all sorts of terrible inequalities and deprivation, which the US government has had a direct hand in creating. And so once you recognize that these injustices exist, then comes the step of concrete action. What should be done about these injustices? And so another element to reparations means putting together programs or schemes to finance the entry of Black people into first-class citizenship, attending to these wrongs that are, date back centuries and are ongoing today. So that's the first piece of what, broadly defined, one might think about reparations. And with respect to your second question, why have efforts stall? One has to do with the toxicity surrounding the very term reparations. It doesn't bother me But there are many people in this country that when they hear the word reparations itself, the very term is triggering in a way that generates a visceral negative reaction. And so if you ask them why, they might not be able to articulate what exactly reparation is or are, but they know that they do not like it. And we're not just talking about hundreds or thousands. We're talking about millions of people who hold these beliefs. And I'm speaking about average citizens, those who are not lawmakers or appointed officials. But if you zoom out from the everyday citizen and you put a microphone in front of lawmakers, people who have the power to bring forward action, there are familiar arguments to the effect that reparations would be paid to people who are undeserving, that it's impossible to determine who should get what and how much, that white Americans are living today have not injured Black Americans and therefore should not be required to pay for the sins of their slave master forefathers. And another one says that Black people must become self-reliant and self-determined in a way of self-determination. And so, when you think about these objections, one instinct is to dismiss these objections outright, and one might not necessarily be wrong in doing so. But the evidence suggests that there is something going on here that speaks to the tradition of anti-Blackness in America. And what I mean by tradition of anti-Blackness in America is that if you look at any point where you land in the historical record, the Black population has been rendered disposable in America. And just to put in perspective, the perverseness of this, slaveholders, the enslavers, were paid reparations for their loss of property. But here we are, centuries later, still making the charge. And so when you think about the demands for reparations within this context, it explains why there has not been any urgency to provide relief.
Thank you. I'll move to Reverend Boyer now. When we talked earlier, you had called attention not only to defining what reparations is, but I was really struck by the way you talked about when it's for. So in addition to sort of speaking to the questions as you think is important, I'm interested in how you feel defining the kind of time frame for historical harms shapes how we think about reparations and how we fight for it.
Oh, for sure. So this trajectory, this entangled web of what reparations are for and when, we have, just to be very clear, we have yet to be at a point in American existence where the knee of the government was not on the necks of Black people. So whether that is slavery, to Jim Crow, to mass incarceration, throw redlining in between, throw school segregation in there, housing segregation. So so even to the modern day, in the way that we see policing, economic disparities, wealth disparities, in the way, wage disparities, people doing the same jobs getting paid less, and all of these things, for the most part, protected legally. Even just last week on the 17th, we commemorated the 50th anniversary of Nixon declaring the drug war. Billions of dollars in New Jersey alone, $11 billion spent to enforce the drug war, when Black people use and sell drugs actually less than white folks. This is done through law. This is $11 billion over the past 10 years over a failed drug war. We see these things are measurable, and they are even in the right now. And so from the dollars directly related to slavery, and there's plenty of ways that you can figure it out, to the dollars of the modern day, the reason it must be done and it must be repaired both in the context of slavery and now is because people will make the same argument now over the drug war that they were making then over slavery. And folks have benefited from America, New Jersey, whoever, never taking accountability and paying what's due and rectifying the damage which has been done. Just simply put, In any other context outside of Black people, reparations is not controversial, right? If somebody crashes into your car, you want reparations from their insurance company to make you whole. If someone takes someone's life, you want reparations through victims' compensation funds. If someone does you harm and illegally messes up your business, you want reparations through civil penalties and litigation. In any other context, it is appropriate, it is understood, it is right. It only brings forth a visceral response when it's connected to doing right by Black people. So that's why now has to be.
Thank you. Yeah, it's that continuum that I really appreciated the argument about. So Mr. Haygood, you have been in the trenches of these debates and leading the campaign here in New Jersey for a reparations task force with others. And you've talked about kind of what a non-starter the term is. So how are you defining reparations in the task force and what challenges have you faced?
Sure. So thanks again for the great question, Liz. And I just got to say, it's so great to be in this conversation with you, Professor Maychew, and my dear friend, Reverend Dr. Charles Boyer. I love this conversation. I think it's right on time. And I love that we're having this conversation as it's hosted by NJ Pack. So to your question, 2 years ago, when you said the word reparations, it would unsettle people deeply, right? You could see them. You say the word reparations, and it was as if you said a curse word or you said a word that deeply offended them, and it would unsettle people. I don't mean to suggest that the word reparations lands now and it's more normalized, but we're in the middle of a international pandemic caused by COVID-19. We're in the middle of a police brutality against Black bodies pandemic, and each of those pandemics really emanate from a broader challenge we're having with structural racism, that we all stand, each of us stand on a foundation, and the foundation is cracked by structural racism, and that structural racism is rooted in slavery. And I think that we're in this moment now where for the last 15 months, there's been this really intense focus on the issue of race, that people are now having conversations around race that we previously, and I use the word we as the royal we as a country, have been unwilling to have. President Biden is uttering the word reparations. At the federal level, HR 40, the legislation that would create a task force at the federal level around reparations, there's getting some movement. That legislation, as you know, was introduced by the late Congressman John Conyers 35 years ago, and it sat until 2019 when it had a hearing, and just a few weeks ago, it began to get some traction. So the word reparations is being uttered way more than it was in the last year or two alone. The fact that as NJ Pack is hosting this conversation speaks to the way in which the word is getting some traction. I say all that though, say not to suggest that we have normalized the word reparations, because Reverend Boyer and I have done a lot of work to stand with some really courageous legislators here in New Jersey as part of a broader coalition of folks across the state to get a bill, to your point, Liz, introduced called the New Jersey Reparations Task Force. And when asking why resistance to the word reparations, the first question I think folks have to grapple with is, do they think there's a need to repair? And if they do, what repair from what? And if they agree there needs to be some repair, what does the repair look like? And I do think the challenge that some folks have with the word reparations, particularly in New Jersey, is it impacts how we see ourselves as a state. So I do think, and I'm generalizing here, and I don't mean to offend native New Jerseyans, but I do think there's a sense, as someone who's from Denver, Colorado originally, that we in New Jersey like to think of ourselves as a state that has always kind of been a beacon for democracy. And we concretize the thinking around who we think we are based on our contrast against other states. So I have heard, as I know you all have, as I know folks in the line have, maybe some of us have even done this, we contrast our behavior against some of the bad actors, very often Southern states. So as they say, we're pushing for some social justice piece, and they'll say back to us, well, we're not Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Philly. We're not that Southern state. We are an enlightened state. And we have always acted in an enlightened way. We've always been a place of deep inclusion. And I do think that there is a piece of New Jersey that is progressive leaning. We are, after all, one of the most racially diverse states in the country, right? We are also one of the wealthiest states in the country, but we're also a state where that really rich diversity exists alongside some really deeply entrenched racial segregation. We're also a state where this really, really rich, this prosperity exists alongside some really punishing poverty. And we're a state, people don't often appreciate this, to Charles Boyer's point, we're a state where Black people here confront some of the worst racial disparities in the country in almost every direction: wealth, health, criminal justice, education, you name it, criminal justice. I mean, we are a state where by the numbers, it's very difficult to be Black. And we know that because the racial disparities tell us. I just want to offer this one, and then I just want to say quickly where it comes from and why reparations as a conversation is so timely. So in New Jersey, as I mentioned, we're one of the wealthiest states in the country. It's in this state that the median net wealth for white families is $352,000. It's the highest net wealth of any family in the country, white families, $352,000. But by sharp, staggering, really shameful contrast, the median net wealth for Black families is just $6,100. $352,000 median net wealth white families, $6,100 for Black families. My colleague Laura Sullivan was able to break that number down further to the individual level. And there she found that the individual net wealth for Black adults in New Jersey is $179, right? 179 United States dollars, less than the cost of a number of things, including the laptops that kids are using to learn online at home on. And that is directly related to slavery in this state, that ours was a state that was founded on slavery. It was a state that gave every white English settling family 150 acres of land. And it also gave those same families an additional 150 acres of land for every enslaved Black person who worked on that land. So that racial wealth gap that we have today was conceived of, it was birthed in slavery in this state, and a series of policies and practices and behaviors followed such that you can trace a direct line from that racial wealth gap today back to slavery. And so quickly, when people think about that racial wealth gap, there's really one of two reactions. One is, well, that's Black people's fault. There's something wrong with Black people. The reason that the individual net wealth and the median net wealth is so low for Black folks is because there's something wrong with their DNA. They can't save, they're prodigal with their finances, they don't work hard, and when they do work hard, they're spendthrifts, right? There's something wrong with them. The opposite is true, which is that that racial wealth gap was designed in slavery in this state. And so if we're really gonna have a conversation about Juneteenth and commemorating the legacy of slavery, it's gotta include, so how do we repair not just that harm back then, but that harm that has endured to 2021? See the racial wealth gap as one example.
Thank you so much. And you've really moved us right into the next part of our conversation, which was about the case for reparation. And you've really made it so eloquently from the work that you've done. But maybe I'll turn it back to Reverend Boyer on the case. You know, there's sort of a moral case, a legal case, and an economic case. And I'm sure people sort of and all of you, while you come from specific sort of disciplinary locations on this, you are really looking at it holistically. So from your perspective, you know, I'm sure people look to you for moral leadership on this, but what is the sort of the case that you feel is most important to make?
For sure. And thank you for that question. And so pretty much every religious tradition has some type of structure to repair harm done. You know, obviously I can speak most specifically from the Christian perspective. And so I'm taking a very narrow perspective here, but this perspective as well does cross lines with all the Judeo-Christian and even Muslim traditions. So reparations and economic justice is a biblical concept. It's a divine mandate. Most folks would argue, folks who are even atheists, that many of our laws have rooting in the Mosaic code, the Mosaic law. So, right. So when the children of Israel, they're leaving Egypt, God tells them to go get provisions from the Egyptians. It, in fact, says they plundered the Egyptians. They come out with wealth. So right away, the very story about let my people go freedom, they come out with wealth, with provisions in order to have some level of compensation for the 400 plus years of uncompensated labor. And then that becomes a necessary tradition and mandate that God puts upon them, even in their slave economies. It says in Deuteronomy, in the Deuteronomy, the code and the law there, when you send a slave out from you as a free person, that you should not send them out empty-handed. Provide liberally out of your flock. First of all, they weren't to be in slavery in perpetuity. That's a whole nother thing. It was a short-term engagement. It was not long-term. It was not generational. It did not pass down. While white families were passing down wealth, Black families were forced to be passed down as slaves, born and bred like animals. So it says, provide liberally out of your flock, your threshing floor, your wine press, giving them some of your bounty, which the Lord your God has blessed you with. And remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. This is the reason I lay this command on you today. It becomes part of the law. In Proverbs, I love this proverb that says, the good leave an inheritance to their children's children, but the sinner's wealth is laid up for the righteous. The field of the poor may yield much fruit, but it is swept away through injustice. And that is what we've seen, the labor of Black people generationally stripped away. It cannot produce, it cannot be passed down inherently because it has been stripped away in every single generation systemically. And so we cannot, there is a moral obligation, there is a scriptural, there is a theological, there is a legal piece. And so when we look at all of this, and as I talked about before, how this has this continuum of theft of Black wealth and Black labor, this continuum of theft of the ability for Black people to be made whole, has to be repaired at some point. At what point? At what point do you take responsibility? There would be no New Jersey economy, no American economy without generations that have been built upon slave labor and the stealing of labor and the removing of competition from the marketplace by severely limiting Black people's ability to even be in the marketplace at an equitable pace. The last piece I'll give, because I'm a Black preacher, I got to bring in Nicodemus. Nicodemus can't even be born again unless he redeems the folks he stole from and pays everyone back with interest. And so here we are. This is where we are, the coffers of the New Jersey economy. Right now, New Jersey is sitting on a $10 billion surplus. How does that come into the conversation? The billions of dollars being spent into punitive places where we always find the money to deal with Black people. When we want to incarcerate and put Black people in chains, we can always find the money. If we begin to dismantle those systems, if we begin to pull all that back and begin to invest money in Black folks rather than steal money from Black folks, the case for reparations is made morally, systemically, economically. The pathway is there, the infrastructure is there. We need to break down the systems of oppression and do it. That is the moral obligation.
Thank you so much. And Professor Metu, coming from a legal perspective, you've talked in really interesting ways about both the possibilities and the limits of a legal case for reparations, but it's the thing that I think a lot of people think of first.
So, I'll just add to what Reverend Boyer just so powerfully laid out, that the moral valence for reparation is perhaps the strongest path to relief that we have, the instrument that we can use to make any meaningful inroads in the organizing and activity in the reparation space. In the law, we talk about this concept of making one whole. That is, when someone has been injured, the law theoretically provides a pathway for redress. And that's what the body of cases and statutes that speak to the subject of remedies are all about. And so there's a sense that legal claims are a natural home for reparations activity. And if you look back at history and some present day efforts, the law has in fact been used as a vehicle for reparations claims for Black suffering. And one is under a theory that is known as unjust enrichment. And I'll underscore the word unjust, which is a term that is broad, but is also morally charged. And the basic idea behind that is that, if the defendant has received some ill-gotten benefit at the plaintiff's expense, then the plaintiff is entitled to get back what they lost. And so a typical claim for unjust enrichment doesn't mean that the defendant necessarily did something wrong, doesn't mean that the defendant is a wrongdoer, rather that they have received something that they are not lawfully entitled to. So, for example, if a bank accidentally deposits your check into someone else's bank account, the bank can sue the third party for unjust enrichment. And so this is the legal theory that class of plaintiffs who are descendants of people who were enslaved in the United States have used to pursue reparations. In fact, in the early 2000s, there was a federal lawsuit that was filed in court in Illinois, where the plaintiffs were claiming that insurance companies and banks that had loaned money to slave traders unjustly benefited from the profits in slave activity. And so they were seeking to be made whole, to be restored to what those banks were unjustly received. And another example where we've seen the legal suits brought in pursuit of reparations involves the pillaging of Black Wall Street in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Greenwood to be more specific, where the class of plaintiffs there said that this injury is something that is recognizable under law, and therefore we are entitled to be made whole for the damages that the defendants in that case had suffered. And in that case, the defendants were the city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma. And in both instances, and there are other examples, the claims were dismissed for a number of reasons. And if you dive down and take a deeper look at some of the analysis that flows from these decisions, and also zoom out and think about how the law operates in these types of situations, the through line is that our system of laws is shaped by political and economic forces that serve the interests of those who have power, not those who are living their lives along the margins of American society. And agents of the law, lawmakers, judges, prosecutors, policing as an institution are shaped by these very same forces that historically and today continue to be adverse to the causes of racialized groups. And so while theoretically there should be a legal pathway, we have seen the evidence suggest that the law itself is not an instrument that will move people to bring forward and pay forward, rather, the reparations that are long past due.
Thank you. And that's where Mr. Haygood and Reverend Boyer come in as organizers, is that movement. So we're now going to move to the question of what forms reparations can take, responding to the ways that everybody has articulated the case and sort of the nature of it. I think part of what makes this such a contested issue is that people aren't necessarily talking about the same thing. Everybody might be imagining something different, a toxic word, as you all said. But there are a huge range of actions that have been taken under the name of reparations in other contexts. So, other countries think mostly of a reparations package, quote unquote, and that can include formal apologies, reinvestments in communities, memorials and museums, police reform and other policy correctives, as well as cash payments to individuals. And here in the US, one of our most comprehensive reparations packages was made in 1988 for the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And this included cash payments, but also school curricula, investment and funds to preserve historic sites, preserve internment camps as historic sites and museums, as well as apologies and a number of other things. So I think what has been critical to any of these efforts is that the form is defined by those have been historically harmed, not by policymakers. And so that it's a response to those demands articulated by those communities. So obviously it's going to look very different in different contexts. So I wondered in this place, in this moment, what forms you all think reparations should take, and maybe also just as important, who you think should decide and define what form it should take. So I'll just open this to anyone, any of you who wants to take this first.
So I could take a first stab at that. So I think Liz, it invokes all of those things that you just described to get at the root word of reparations, which is repair. And I do think it's been interesting. We have, as I shared, been working on this reparations task force legislation. And as I shared, we got it introduced. Every Black elected official in New Jersey supports the bill. When it was introduced, there was quite a bit of ceremony around its introduction. It was originally introduced in 2019, which, as folks know, was the 400th anniversary year of Black folks' arrival in Jamestown, Virginia. We've subsequently had numerous conversations with some of the white legislators around moving it. I just want to share a quick interaction with one of those legislators on the Assembly side who said to us in a meeting, he said, look, I'll support the task force if you would just call it something else. You can call it an economic justice task force, an equity task force. You can call it anything, but just that word reparations, like, why does that have to be in the word of the task force? Why does it have to be a reparations task force? And we said back to him that the concession we're making, it was that we're asking you for a task force. You all know very often when elected officials create task forces, first of all, they're all too happy to create task forces because task forces often are, after being created, issue reports, and those reports go on one of those, right? But to your question, Liz, because the issue of repairing the enduring harm from slavery is such an all-encompassing question, and we're seeing states do different things around it now, we thought that the most thoughtful way to get at it would be through a task force. The reality is we have a sense right now of ways you could close the racial wealth gap, right? We could actually skip past the task force and get straight to the repair. But I do think this invokes the early point that I think Professor Metchu or Reverend Boyer made, that this is really one of the painful realities of race. One of my favorite rappers, Mos Def, talks about how the length of Black life is treated with short worth. And this is really a painful thing to discuss, to be Black and to recognize that your life is valued at a much lower rate than everybody else, which is why in a state like New Jersey, for example, we tolerate some of the incredibly shameful inequality, to include our youth justice system. We are a state of 9 million people, more now, 9 million people. We have the worst Black to white youth incarceration disparity rate in the country. In New Jersey, a Black child is 21 times more likely to be in prison than a white kid. And in this state of 9 million people, more than 9 million people, there are a grand total of 8 white kids in prison. Now, we're obviously not arguing for the deeper incarceration of white kids, but we absolutely know that if there were just 8 Black kids in prison and the rest were white, and add this additional data point that, as is the case, New Jersey was spending almost $500,000 to incarcerate each of those kids, we would be declaring a state of emergency to go reclaim our kids. But because there are just 8 white kids and the rest are Black and brown, there's a certain level of comfort. And we tell ourselves stories that justify that, to include that Black kids are just more violent. Black kids that's just what they do. Where else would they go? If we close the youth prisons, Ryan, Charles Boyer, Professor Metru, Liz, where would they go? So we tell ourselves stories that make us comfortable with the racial disparities, and those stories point to the individual failures of Black people. And I would love, Liz, your perspective on this, because we have been seeing, and I'll say more about this, but we had a really powerful Juneteenth commemoration in support of the New Jersey Reparations Task Force this past weekend. Hundreds of people joined on that day, and about half of them were white folks. And it was beautiful. I know we're going to get into a conversation about allyship, but there is this realization that when we're advocating for racial justice measures like reparations, there are real limits to what Black people can do alone. If, as is the case, every Black elected official supports this legislation, and they do, and each of the about 1 million Black people also supported it, it still wouldn't move. And I want to lift this up because we're having this conversation. New Jersey is run politically by 3 white men. There's a white governor in Phil Murphy. There's the Speaker of the Assembly, Craig Coughlin, and the Senate President is Steve Sweeney. So the legislation hasn't moved, not because there aren't white allies who want to push it, not because there isn't support from Black elected officials because it's unanimous, not because Black folks don't want to see it move, but because 3 white men in control of the legislature refuse to simply say the word. And the word is reparations. And so back to the conversation we had in that space with that elected official, we said that the concession we're making is that we're asking you for a task force. The very least that you can do is let us be clear about what we're doing. And so we've been encouraging folks to say the word. The word is reparations, to create a task force to do 2 things. 1, to have this conversation about New Jersey's role in slavery. And the second piece is to then make recommendations around the kinds of policies and practices and deep investments to be made to repair that enduring harm. And they can take shape of any number of things. But the first thing is we got to be willing to say the word reparations and to have this real conversation as part of this task force.
Sounds like what you're saying in part is that one of the forms reparations needs to take is to even say the word reparations. That's sort of the first step, one of the forms.
A related piece to that, Liz, we have spent in the last year, there's just been this really intense and frankly inspirational focus on saying, Black Lives Matter, right? We've seen it. Folks have been moved to the streets. When Dr. King was killed, there were protests in hundreds of cities. When Mr. George Floyd was killed, there were protests in thousands of cities. Millions of people moved to the streets, organized around the principle, the undeniable principle that Black Lives Matter. And we saw this on T-shirts, in yards. You may not have seen it before the George Floyd killing. But now comes the question of, but how do you make Black lives really matter? And how can we have just celebrated Juneteenth? I tell you, I watched so many politicians in New Jersey say, we're celebrating Juneteenth and freedom without saying, but then how did you repair the enduring harm from slavery, a legacy that we still live in presently by the numbers? And so I think there's this disconnect around how willing we are to make Black lives really matter. You can't do that, Liz, to your point, without saying the word reparations.
Mm-hmm. Well, what are the forms or what are the ways that you all feel are most important to broadcast to people and encourage people to define reparation and to make, as Mr. Haygood's suggesting, make Black lives matter?
So I can jump in on that, and I just want to add to the last piece that Mr. Haygood just shared about what might be viewed as performative allyship, right? You can put up the Black Lives Matter flag. You can change your Instagram picture to a black square. You can do all of these things that signal solidarity and action. but how do you move those actions or those words to concrete steps? And I'll add something that is a sobering but not surprising piece of information, which is that in the time since George Floyd was murdered, looking today at present day polls, they show that white support for Black Lives Matter is lower now than before George Floyd was murdered. And so that is a point worth underscoring, because I think that the dialogue, as we continue to have it in society, has been that we are in a current moment that we need to take advantage of. But I think what this evidence shows is that these moments are transitory, are fleeting, and they rise up not because there has been a change of heart, but because the circumstances at that particular moment demand action. So the question about how do we move past performative allyship, I think it's a difficult question. And what the history has shown is that what works in these circumstances or something is something that the late great Harvard law professor Derek Bell called interest convergence, which is that even if you are able to build these successful multiracial coalition of people of goodwill, which you will have allies, then there are those, as Ryan just pointed out, how do you get someone to even mention reparations, to embrace a discussion about reparations that acknowledges that what we're trying to do here is repair harms that has been visited on the Black population for centuries and centuries. And how do you persuade people who are committed, one might say, to a white supremacist version of America? And when I say white supremacist, I don't mean to invoke images of people clad in white sheets or the Proud Boys, but rather a set of beliefs that institutionally and culturally, white people should occupy a certain status, and by virtue, racialized groups should be condemned to a lower status. And so the challenge is, how do you move these people who are otherwise not persuaded by concrete evidence related to racial disproportionality in employment, in mass incarceration, in poverty rates, and so on? So part of what the effort here is to find something that gets people to see what's in it for them, right? And it's an argument that I don't enjoy making, because what it implies is that you are necessarily conceding the fact that the humanity and suffering of the Black population will not be accepted on its own terms, that you have to extract this other value which will get people to buy into the mission. And so we have seen how this has played out in real terms. And I'll use affirmative action, for example. When the Supreme Court said in 1967 that affirmative action has now gained the support of American institutions, it wasn't because of the history of racial inclusion of Black people in higher education. It was because of the diversity rationale, that if we include people, a critical mass was the term, from racialized groups in these spaces, the benefits will confer not only to the racialized groups, but also to the white majority. And you can trace different data points throughout our history where we see interest convergence at play. And so it seems to me, as somewhat perverted as it might seem, that has been a tool historically that has worked in service of creating these rights protective measures for marginalized groups.
Thank you. Reverend Boyer, would you like to speak to either the point of sort of how to mobilize people or what forms you feel are most important for reparations to take?
Yeah, I think just quickly to bounce off what's been said, one, it's critical that we include the folks most impoverished, the folks who are bearing the wounds of structural racism the most at the table to help frame what form reparations take. So I think that that's a super critical piece. Two, we also, I mean, we do know, right? We do know some of the forms that, and all of the pieces we've talked about are necessary. But one, right, land was stripped, right? So literally, tangibly, in terms of housing and real estate, people need to be given a stake. And we know that that is one of the greatest paths and one of the issues, even in the housing crisis, stripped wealth away from Black families because of the predatory lending, right? And so tangibly, housing and land and real estate has to be part of the metrics. Two, we know that education vastly begins to, the higher education level someone is able to obtain, the less their chance of falling into poverty. And so I don't believe any Black person should ever have to pay for any education at any level. And Black folks, all student loans for Black folks should be forgiven, especially when the vast majority of these institutions got to where they are through slavery themselves. So that's another one. Two, Black people shouldn't even have to pay taxes. How are you going to tax the people that you used to make work for free? That, I mean, it's ridiculous. Then also, we know things like universal basic income, right? All of these pieces should be part of the matrix in order to begin. And I really love the point the professor made about this whole interest piece, because it continues to feed into this. The only way to get things done for Black people is if we take Black out of the equation and all of a sudden make it palatable for enough people. And then we have a rising tide raises all boats. Well, if I'm on the low part of the tide, you keep raising higher and we're still the same distance apart. So no, this has to be a Black thing. And everyone's liberation is tied to Black liberation. If we start where the most harm was done, the most good will be done for everybody else. So the last piece that I would add to this, so those are some the very tangible ways that I think are critical in order to really get at this thing. But lastly, we see this war unfolding right now around critical race theory, right? Around teaching. And one of the reasons that is such a fire behind it is because to teach the truth is to undo the lie of white supremacy, of white exceptionalism, of white picking yourself up by your own bootstraps, of white, my parents weren't slaveholders, we came over as immigrants and we worked hard. It undoes, it unravels all of that lie. It unravels the lie of this happened so long ago. Things like Tulsa, that was just one instance. These pieces happen all over the country, even in Manhattan. You have places where land and wealth were stripped from Black folks, even when we made it, even when Reconstruction was unwound and taken from us, we still pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps, build our own businesses, and they dropped bombs on us and raped and pillaged our possessions and literally stole them. If that is to be taught, if we begin to teach the truth of history, we will find that the raping and pillaging of Black people has yet to stop. And so that is why there is this such visceral reaction to teaching critical race theory, because it undoes the lie of white supremacy and the lie of American exceptionalism.
Thank you.
So I can't resist. I'm so sorry, Liz, but that gets to the heart of why people, and here I just want to generalize and say, in my experience, white people resist reparations, because if you tell that truth to undo that lie, then you have to tell the truth about how white people generally have benefited from the current system we have. And so if in New Jersey, as is the case, about 80% of white people are homeowners and less than 40% of Black people own their homes, and if, as is the case, home ownership is the primary driver of wealth, and if, as is the case in New Jersey, we were a colony founded upon slavery that gave white people land and incentivized having Black people work on that land, to the point that some 100+ years later, our individual net wealth is $179. If we tell the truth to undo the lie, then white folks will have to own that there's a benefit, there's a privilege, there's a system that was designed to advantage white folks generally, including through home ownership, which is why it's at 80%, and why when white folks own homes on average, they're much more valuable. So I live in the city of Newark, beautiful neighborhood. If you put my home just as it is, as this house is that I'm in, and by the way, only 20% of the people who live in Newark own their homes. So that 80% of the folks who live in this mighty city are renters. And as I mentioned, home ownership is the primary driver of wealth. So how do you build wealth in a city where 80% of the folks who rent their homes? But if you move my house 8 miles to Millburn, you'll find there that the median value of homes is $1.1 million. Same housing stock, different value. And I think that is all part of this thing. So when I have had experiences with our white brothers and sisters around reparations, what folks recognize, and I'm generalizing here, and I would love your reaction to this, Liz, but there's a sense, wait a minute, you're to repair the harm you're talking about, I would have to tell the truth about a system that has advantaged me because I'm white. And that unsettles me because the story I tell myself, and perhaps that I've told my kids over generations, is that we work very hard for what we have. And if folks would just conform to the American work ethic, those Black folks, they wouldn't need reparations. Nationally, right? It would take, at the national level, it would take Black people 228 years, a century and 2 centuries and 28 years to get the wealth that white folks have today. But there's no amount of personal responsibility to be taken to close that. The only way you close it, to a question here, is to make very specific investments, deepening home ownership, zero interest loans. You could turn Section 8 housing into a space where people could begin to own their, there's a lot you could do. It's never, it's never ever about the resources. It's always about how we prioritize directing those resources. And we haven't done that in a way to empower Black folks, which is why, even though New Jersey has some of the wealthiest Black people in the country, we also are a state where our individual net wealth is $179.
Thank you, and I'm so glad that you have framed the kind of historical lie and what happens when you get to people very late, white people who have both grown up with a myth and have already passed it down to their kids. And I'll just speak for myself that as I'm grappling with my own family history and ongoing actions, I am struggling with teaching my kids to understand their lives and their own histories in relation to reparations, in relation to this historical context that we've all been talking about, so that there isn't that myth, but from the beginning they're understanding what they have, and in the context of what's been robbed and sort of what they've inherited just because of the color of their skin, so that it's not so much about did I do it or was I there, but rather what have I done to undo it. That's sort of, obviously I'm working on this professionally, but I feel like that's sort of the hardest and the most important job that I have. That's.
I want to thank you for having that conversation, because I think that, like that, if there's a takeaway from tonight's conversation, is that we need more of that. I think as we talked about, we all stand on this foundation and it's cracked by racism, but we didn't create the cracks, we inherited them. And so I think as people of faith and of conscience, it's on us to take responsibility for those cracks. And that's really one of the takeaways of tonight.
Mm-hmm. So I've been asked to give like a lightning round, and I'll do this to the professor and the reverend, of just 1 or 2 minutes, or maybe just 1 minute, one statement of what you want to ask the audience to do. What action step do you think that the folks who are listening tonight can take? And I'll start with Reverend.
Well, let me say, call the power brokers in the state. Call Coughlin and call Sweeney. They can post these bills up tomorrow and tell them reparations task force now. It's really that simple. And I've told people on other forums, especially when we talk about allies, you know, I really think it's critically important, because what they are afraid of is white backlash. They say that themselves. They are afraid that white people are going to punish them for having a reparations task force. So I really ask white people, please call folks and say, I am white and I support reparations. And I really think that that's critical. And I think that is an actionable step, which is really critical.
Thank you. Professor, you have the last word until the questions.
I'll second what the Reverend just said, that, you know, it takes people who are not the oppressed, but people who are fighting arm in arm with the systems of inequality, making the calls to say that I am someone who is not a direct victim, but I recognize the righteousness, the lawfulness, the morality of conferring reparations on the terms that reparations are due. And you know, to zoom out, the question is not whether we will win reparations, but rather whether we will fight for reparations, because we have decided for ourselves that they are due. It seems to me ultimately in this reparation fight, it has to be based on a conviction that it's a cause worth pursuing, despite the obstacles of law and public opinion. And if you adopt this mindset, in addition to the actionable items of reaching out to people who are in positions of power, that pursuit can create conditions that convince policymakers who are unmoved by simple appeals to justice.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions, and thank you for entertaining all of those questions and being so specific and impassioned at the same time. So we have one question from the audience that's kind of looping back around to one of the questions we started talking about, and then but maybe we'll go a little more deeply. She says, this is Joanne Katzman, says, I'd like to hear much more specific recommendations for the form of reparations. I personally think it should be a set amount of money paid to each Black person in the country. Also, no more task forces. I think she's with you. But, you know, I think a number of you have sort of in passing identified some specific elements of this, but are there ones that you'd like to return to, or how would you answer this person's question?
So I just quickly, I'd like to, I think I've laid out a bunch of very specific pieces, but I'd also like to say, we should not think about reparations as a one-time shot that just happens and is done. Like slavery did not happen at one point and it was done. It was over the course of hundreds of years. So really deep investments have to be made over a long period of time. I also know someone has raised something about reparations without training would be a disaster. And that kind of plays into this thinking about Black people always being in this kind of like pathological, really dangerous space. And I think the science, the data suggests otherwise, right? So in things done like universal basic income, people who folks would say, oh, they're gonna drink it up, they're gonna smoke it up, they're gonna do all of this and that. What they did was get their basic needs. They were the folks who got universal basic income, and what we've seen in the studies so far have even shown to be more likely to get better jobs because to pay for things like transportation and childcare. And so we really have to be careful about discounting the ability of people who are impoverished to be able to make decisions for themselves. And listen, if we invest generationally over time, the same way Black people were divested from over time, I guarantee you, folks are feeling.
Thank you. And I really appreciate your point about not imagining reparations as a kind of time-bound, time-limited effort, but rather something that we need to embed in a kind of ongoing practice. That's something that we are trying to imagine a sort of like permanent or ongoing curricula that's not only about history and addressing historical denial, but about thinking about education as reparations over the long term. So I think I really appreciate that, and I hope to learn more from you about that. Professor Metu, would you have anything further to talk about in terms of the forms? And I'll just invite again the audience into any further questions that you might have. Please type them into the Q&A, and I'm sure our panelists would be happy to answer.
So just to underscore the point that the Reverend made with respect to the tendency amongst people who are opposed to reparations to indict the Black population at large about their abilities to navigate without training or something to that effect. Putting restrictions on the form that reparations might look like. And I think that we can look at some of the current efforts for racial reparations to Black Americans that have been advanced to assess what might work and what might not work. And I'll use the recent reparations proposal in Evanston, Illinois, which was the first local reparations program that was approved in the country, in which Black Evanstonians would who experience housing discrimination, again, tying back to the point that Ryan had made about the centrality of property ownership to closing the wealth gap. And so Black Evanstonians would receive $25,000 in the form of home improvement costs, down payment to closing, and assistance with mortgage payments. And the critiques from the residents relate to exactly this point that Reverend Boyer just made, which is that it placed too many restrictions on how they can use the money. And part of that reflects a paternalism that suggests that Black people do not deserve the beneficence of money because they don't know what to do with it. And this follows from a tradition that speaks to the ways in which Black money is treated differently in markets broadly from money that is not associated with quote activities that are deemed to be frequented by Black people. And so we are already seeing, we don't have to speculate how this might play out. We have already seen in real time how proposals that do not speak to bringing Black people into first-class citizenship on their own terms, but rather the terms of those who think this is the right path to maneuver Black people towards a higher status. And so, there are other examples that speak to this condition, but I'll end by saying, as the Reverend Boyer put it, any reparations package that is put forth with the theory or the belief that Black people have to have some sort of handholding in order to decide how they best utilize those resources, whether it's reparations to Black-owned businesses, affirmative action programs, youth training programs, scholarships, and so on. That cuts against the spirit of reparations, what it's supposed to do in repairing the harm that has been visited to Black communities in the history of our country.
And can I just say to that? Yeah. So I love that point, because as Professor Mitchell was speaking, I just thought about the last 15 months we've experienced, right? The devastating loss of life of folks from the coronavirus pandemic, a disproportionate number of whom were Black and brown, the assault on Black bodies by law enforcement officials across the country at a pace that it's difficult to count the names of people just in the last 15 months. The realization of how we continue to live in the legacy of slavery, even as we lift up Juneteenth now as a state holiday. And yet this conversation, as one of the takeaways, is can we in New Jersey get the legislature to create a task force to have a conversation about a roadmap to reparations, right? I mean, even that, like, it's kind of it's like anticlimactic, right? Because at the end of this conversation, you would imagine that they're going to ask us for some very big ticket items. But the reality of how race constrains is that at the end of this conversation, which has been a fascinating one and also a painful one of the key takeaways is, can we say the word reparations? And can we get 3 white men in power in New Jersey to support a reparations task force? Even though we could say right now what the repair would look like in terms of investments, can we first stand up a task force to lay the groundwork? And I will say to you, this is not a singular challenge in New Jersey. Before last year, no state in America had ever created a reparations task force. New Jersey got one introduced, as we shared, in 2019. In 2020, California, I think inspired by New Jersey, introduced and passed one, and their task force has met one time. But one of our asks in an election year, so every seat is up in New Jersey's legislature, 120 seats in the Assembly and the Senate. The governor's running for re-election, and in a critical election year, one of our key asks, even as the state is up, to Boyer's point, $10 billion, is, can you create a reparations task force? And the answer to so far from these folks has been, well, can't you call it something else? And we say, absolutely not. Given all that we've outlined, at the very least, we should have a plan to put us on the road to repairing the harm from structural racism rooted in slavery in this state.
Well, hopefully the momentum, I think it's good to acknowledge the incredible momentum that has been built, and how quickly, even since we started meeting each other and talking about this conversation just yesterday, 12 mayors from across the country launched Mayors Organized for Reparations and Equity, saying the word, and pledging to implement pilot reparations to Black Americans in each of their cities, and using that as a kind of laboratory or sort of proof of concept or pressure point for both state and federal actions. So and that was just yesterday, and since we talked. The last question that we'll take from the audience is an interesting one. Do we feel there's any value in having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as Nelson Mandela chaired in South Africa, here in the US, to first recognize the lie, so that we can in fact say the word reparations and move forward in repairing the harm? So I don't know if this is, I won't speak for the questioner, but I don't know if he's suggesting that there's sort of a precondition of sort of truth to reparations, but maybe what the relationship you all see between truth and reparations.
Well, I'll just quickly say, I mean, Jesus said the truth shall set you free. I mean, you have to tell the truth. And again, it gets, as stated earlier, the lie that we have told ourselves as a nation and as a people is the very reason why we're struggling with this right now at this moment. And so truth and reconciliation is extremely important. And again, that must be done on an ongoing basis. And that is really even the work and the discussion and the argument behind critical race theory, because what it does, it injects it injects in the discussion what has been intentionally left out of the historical narrative. And so that, and I go back to the Tulsa to the Greenwood example, because it is emblematic of everything that has taken place in every state all throughout the nation, is the intentional taking away, the intentional hiding, the intentional burning, the intentional not reporting on what happened, the fullness of what happened. And so we have to deal with the fullness of what happened. And that needs to take place not only, so when we look at, for instance, in Germany, it is an ongoing truth and reconciliation process because the mantra is that they never want to go there again. And so between the monuments, the museums, there's an ongoing truth and reconciliation process. Even in what happened in South Africa, it's an ongoing process, and not right, it still has a far way to go, but it is you have to do that. And in South Africa, it is embedded into the Constitution, right? And so a nation which had slavery embedded into the Constitution should be looking at state by state and also on a national level, embedding truth and reconciliation into the very fabric of what we do. Because if we never reconcile the original sin of this nation, we die in our sins and we burn in an eternal hell.
Thank you. Professor Mechu, would you like to close us out? And then I think we're going to turn it back over to our leadership.
So I'll be brief and to just echo everything that the Reverend said, and to answer the question directly about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I think it's a necessary and essential part of any reparations scheme. I had mentioned it at the onset that it's not only addressing what reparations is, addressing the harms that Black people have experienced on account of their race throughout this country, but it's an acknowledgement, acknowledging that we live in a society that has been scarred by what the founders intentionally designed the country. That we live in a society that continues to have terrible inequalities that are attended to those systems on which this country was built, and the government necessarily had a direct hand in it. But it seems to me that the problem with talking about the lie will expose the contradiction that is America. How do you reconcile Thomas Jefferson saying that all men are created equal, while at the same time, the monster of Monticello had enslaved hundreds of people at the time? And so all of this, when we appraise it in its historical context and think about why is critical race theory, people who don't even know what critical race theory is, has become this boogeyman. Why? Because it is a truth-seeking effort. And the reason why the truth-seeking effort has been so vehemently resisted is because it exposes the foundation, the big lie, which America espouses to be, but has never really lived up to that image of itself. And so I think once we wrestle with that aspect of it, and without wrestling with that aspect of it, as again, to use the royal we won't have any meaningful progress in terms of reparations efforts.
Thank you to all of the panelists. This has been incredibly inspiring for me. I've learned so much. I hope all of you in the audience have too. And I'll now turn it back over to our NJPAC leadership. Donna.
Yes, thank you. Oh, I am absolutely certain that all of us learned many good points this evening, important information. I think you can see from the chat that our audience is engaged, is listening, agreed, understanding. And so this is exactly the purpose of these panel discussions. So I can't thank all of you enough for bringing your passion, intelligence. It was really amazing, amazing. Thank you. And most importantly is the action that each of us can take, because that ultimately is the reason why we designed this. Is yes, we want to talk about crucial issues, but also what can each person do? And you gave us a map, so thank you for that. And so moving forward, you know, NJPAC, of course, we have lots of different events coming up and are reopening as well. We'll be back with our Sounds of the City, as well as many of the favorite artists that a lot of you are accustomed to seeing. Next week, we will have actually this week, every Wednesday, we have our Wellness Wednesday movement classes, which have been absolutely amazing. This month, we're saluting the Caribbean culture. So we're either using music from the Caribbean or dance from the Caribbean, but it's every Wednesday at 7:30, so please join us. Shola Roberts will be teaching us this Wednesday. And we also have our Hispanic Youth Showcase on June 29th, next week. And that's been an annual event at NJPAC for years, really highlighting the youth from our Latino community here. And then our next Standing in Solidarity event will be next month, July 19th at 7. And then it's going to be Reflections on Justice, a retrospect on some of the selective social justice panels we've presented over this past year. And our Social Justice Task Force team will be hosting these discussions. So we hope you'll join us in July for that. So for everyone, thank you for your sustained interest. Panel, moderator list, thank you so much. Everyone have a great, great evening. Thank you.